The high prairie wind carried dust and the desperate sound of a child crying. Grace Calder stood in the doorway of her cabin, flour dusting her hands from the bread dough she had been kneading, and listened. The cry came again, sharper this time, followed by the thunder of horse hooves. She wiped her hands quickly on her apron and stepped into the late afternoon light, shading her eyes against the glare that stretched across the Montana Territory grassland. Two riders crested the rise to the east, their horses at full gallop. Between them ran two small figures, their dark hair streaming behind them, their buckskin dresses flashing in the sun. Children, girls, they were running hard, their small legs pumping with the kind of terror that made Grace's heart clench. The riders wore dusty trail coats and wide-brimmed hats pulled low. One of them raised his arm, and sunlight glinted off the barrel of a rifle. Grace did not think. She ran. Her boots pounded the dry earth as she sprinted toward the irrigation ditch that cut between her property and the open range. The smaller girl stumbled, her cry rising in pitch. Grace reached her just as the child's foot caught on an exposed root at the edge of the ditch. The bank crumbled beneath them both. Grace wrapped her arms around the girl as they fell, twisting her body to take the impact. They hit the rocky bottom hard. The air knocked from Grace's lungs, her shoulder and hips scraping against stone. The girl whimpered, her small body trembling. Grace pushed herself up, ignoring the sharp pain in her ribs, and pulled the child to her feet. Above them, the older girl had stopped running. She turned, grabbed a stone from the ground, and hurled it with surprising force at the nearest rider. It struck him square in the jaw. His horse reared, and the rifle shot meant for the girl's went wide, the crack of it echoing across the prairie. "Run!" Grace shouted to the older girl. "My cabin!" The girl hesitated only a moment, then bolted toward the log structure. Grace lifted the smaller child bodily and scrambled up the far side of the ditch, her boots slipping on loose dirt. Her lungs burned. The riders wheeled their horses around, circling to cut them off. Grace made it to her door, shoved the smaller girl inside, and grabbed the older one by the arm, pulling her across the threshold. She slammed the door shut and dropped the heavy timber beam across the brackets, her hands shaking so badly it took 2 tries. Through the small window beside the door, she saw the riders pull up outside. One of them spat blood into the dirt, working his jaw. The other leaned forward in his saddle, his face shadowed beneath his hat. Grace moved to the fireplace mantel and reached for her husband's old revolver, a .32 caliber pocket model he had carried during their journey west. She checked the cylinder with trembling fingers. 4 rounds loaded. She had not fired it in 2 years, not since the day she buried Samuel, when she had fired a single shot into the air as the preacher said the final words over his grave. The weight of the gun in her hand brought back the memory of that bitter winter day. The pneumonia that had stolen him away. The loneliness that had settled over her like snow. Grace positioned herself between the window and the 2 girls who huddled together by the cold fireplace. Their eyes wide and dark. The smaller one was maybe 8 years old, the older perhaps 12. Their clothes bore traditional Blackfeet, beadwork now dusty and torn from their flight. They watched her without speaking, their breathing rapid and shallow. "They are children," Grace called back, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "You have no right." "We got every right," the other man said. "Sheriff's writ says we do. Now open this door." Grace raised the revolver and fired twice through the gap beside the doorframe, aiming high. The shots cracked loud in the confined space. Both horses shied violently. The riders cursed and backed off, but they did not leave. They circled the cabin slowly, their voices low and angry. "You just made this harder on yourself." The first man shouted, "We'll be back with the sheriff. Then we'll see how brave you are." The hoof-beats faded. Grace lowered the gun, her arms aching. She looked at the two girls. The smaller one had tears streaking the dust on her face. The older one held her sister's hand, her jaw set in defiance, but her eyes betrayed her fear. Grace knelt slowly, setting the revolver on the floor beside her. She kept her movements calm and deliberate. "You are safe here," she said quietly. "I will not let them take you." The girls did not respond. They had learned Grace understood not to trust the words of white settlers, but they stayed where they were, and after a long moment, the older girl's grip on her sister's hand loosened just slightly. Grace rose and moved to the stove. She would need to boil water, tend their injuries, and figure out what in blazes had just happened. But for now, she added wood to the fire and reached for the kettle. The wind rattled the shutters. Somewhere beyond the fence line, she glimpsed the flicker of a distant lantern watching. The sight of it sent a chill down her spine. Someone was keeping track of what happened here. Someone who would report back. Night fell across the prairie like a curtain, deep and absolute. Grace lit 2 oil lamps and kept the shutters closed. She moved quietly, aware of the girls tracking her every motion. The smaller one sat hunched on the floor, cradling her scraped arm. The older girl stood near the door, listening. Grace filled the kettle from the water barrel beside the stove and set it to heat. The barrel was lower than it should have been. For 3 weeks now, her pump had been running weak, producing barely a trickle. She had attributed it to the drought that had gripped the region all summer. But John Novak, her nearest neighbor, 3 MEI south, had mentioned something darker when she last saw him in town, Kingsley's Dam. She had heard the name Nathan Kingsley before. Everyone had. He was the biggest rancher in the territory, owner of the Circle K spread that stretched for miles along Storm Creek. He had come west from Philadelphia with Eastern money and Eastern ideas about how land should be managed, which meant it should be controlled, monopolized, and extracted for every cent of profit. John had told her that Kingsley was diverting water from the creek source at Cold Spring, building a massive dam that left the downstream homesteads and the Blackfeet lands to the north dry and desperate. John had been bitter about it, and Grace had seen the fear in his eyes. Water was life out here, and Kingsley controlled too much of it. Grace brought clean rags, carbolic salve, and witch hazel to the table and gestured for the girls to come closer. The older one moved first, pulling her sister with her. Up close, Grace could see the exhaustion in their faces, the scratches on their arms and legs, the dust caked in their hair. The smaller girl's forehead felt warm to the touch, fever mild but present. "My name is Grace," she said, speaking slowly. "I'm going to clean your cuts. It may sting." The older girl met her eyes, weighing something. Then she nodded once and sat down, pulling her sister onto the bench beside her. Grace worked as gently as she could, wiping away dirt and blood, applying the salve to the deeper scrapes. The smaller girl flinched, but did not cry out. When Grace pressed the back of her hand to the child's forehead again, the fever had not worsened, but it was there, a warning. Grace broke off pieces of bread from the loaf she had been making and poured water into 2 tin cups. She set these in front of the girls and stepped back, giving them space. The older one picked up the bread, sniffed it, then handed half to her sister. They ate slowly, watching Grace over the rims of the cups. "What are your names?" Grace asked. The older girl hesitated, then pointed to herself. "Istas." She touched her sister's shoulder. "Kenna." Grace repeated the names carefully, committing them to memory. "Istas. Coena." She nodded her thanks and turned to check the doorbeam again, testing its weight. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the faint smell of sagebrush and distant campfires. She moved to the window and peered through a crack in the shutter. The lantern light she had seen earlier was still there, motionless at the fence line. Someone was keeping watch. She returned to the girls and unfolded 2 wool blankets from the chest at the foot of her bed. She spread them on the floor near the hearth, where the warmth from the coals would last through the night. Ista studied the arrangement, then guided Cholena to the blankets. The younger girl curled up immediately, her eyes already closing. Ista sat beside her, one hand resting protectively on her sister's shoulder. Grace settled into the wooden chair by the table, the revolver within reach. She did not expect to sleep. Her mind churned with questions and memories. She thought of Samuel, of the way he had looked at her on their wedding day, his eyes full of hope and plans for their future. He had been so certain they could make a life here, carve something good out of this harsh land. But the land had taken him, as it took so many. And now it was trying to take these children. The hours passed slowly. Coena's breathing evened into the rhythm of sleep. Ista's eventually lay down, but kept her eyes open, staring at the ceiling beams. Grace found herself thinking about the older girl's aim with that stone, the fierce determination in her small face. These were not helpless victims. They were survivors, and they had fought back. Before dawn, Grace rose and checked the water barrel again, less than half full. She would need to ride into Lantern's End today. The girls needed proper medicine, and she needed answers. She checked on them once more, then slipped out the door into the gray pre-dawn light, securing the beam behind her. Her horse, a sturdy bay mare named Bess, stood in the small corral behind the cabin. Grace saddled her quickly, her movements practiced despite the stiffness in her bruised shoulder. The ride to town took an hour. The sun rose behind her, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. Lantern's End was a small settlement clustered around a crossroads, its buildings low and weathered. Grace tied Bess outside Dr. Emmett Doyle's office, a narrow structure with a painted sign that had faded to near illegibility. The doctor was already awake, boiling instruments in a pot on his stove. EMTT was a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen too much suffering. He looked up as Grace entered, his expression shifting to concern when he saw the scrapes on her hands and the tension in her face. "Grace, what happened?" she told him quickly, keeping her voice low. EMTT listened without interrupting, his frown deepening. When she finished, he moved to his supply cabinet and pulled down a small brown bottle of laudanum, a jar of clean bandages, and a packet of willow bark powder. "The fever is likely from exhaustion and fear, as much as infection," he said, wrapping the supplies in paper. "Keep her warm, hydrated. The laudanum is for pain if she needs it, but use it sparingly. The willow bark tea will help bring the fever down." Grace nodded, reaching for her coin purse. EMTT waved her off. "Pay me when the harvest comes in." "If it comes in." He glanced toward the window, and something in his expression made Grace pause. There was worry there, but also something else. Something guarded. "EMTT, what is it?" He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Kingsley's dam is killing this town, Grace. The small farms cannot survive without that creek water, and the Blackfoot families north of here are in even worse shape. People are angry, angry enough to do something about it." EMTT's mouth tightened. "Some are talking sabotage, others are talking about leaving. And then there is the other business." He paused, his eyes darting to the door, as if checking for listeners. "What other business?" The doctor lowered his voice further. "There have been rumors. Children disappearing from the Blackfeet camps. Some say bounty hunters are taking them under false pretenses, claiming they are orphans or runaways. There is money in it, Grace. Some kind of scheme to place them with ranchers or send them east to those boarding schools. The territorial government has programs for that. But this is different. This is dirty. This is theft dressed up as charity." Grace felt cold. Those men yesterday, they said they had a writ. Probably forged, EMTT said grimly. Sheriff Hollis would sign anything if the price was right. Kingsley owns him. He paused again, and Grace noticed his hands were shaking slightly as he wrapped the medicines. Grace, you need to be careful. If you stand against Kingsley, you will lose everything. He has destroyed better men than he stopped himself, turned away. Better men than who? EMTT shook his head. Just be careful. Grace thanked him and left, but the conversation lingered in her mind. There had been something in EMTT's tone, something she could not quite name. Fear, certainly, but also guilt. She dismissed the thought. EMTT had always been kind to her, had helped her through Samuel's final days without asking for payment. He was a good man. She stopped at the general store to buy cornmeal and coffee. As she waited for the clerk to wrap her purchases, she noticed Harriet Bell, the schoolteacher, standing near the back of the store. Harriet was a slender woman in her 30s, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, known for running the only school within 20 mem. She caught Grace's eye and nodded, then approached. Grace, I heard about the excitement at your place yesterday. The whole town is talking about it. Grace stiffened. News travels fast. It always does. Harriet lowered her voice, glancing around. Is it true you are sheltering Blackfeet children? I am sheltering children who were being hunted. That is all. Harriet studied her for a long moment. You know what people will say? I know what they should say, that hunting children is an abomination. But I suspect they will say something different. A flicker of something crossed Harriet's face. Approval, perhaps, or respect. Well, if you need anything, let me know. I may be able to help. She paused, then added, I know people. I hear things. Sometimes that can be useful. Grace nodded, surprised by the offer. Harriet had always been pleasant, but distant, focused on her school and her students. The two women had never been close, but perhaps times like these forced people to choose sides. Grace took her purchases and headed back to the cabin. The sun was high now, and the heat pressed down like a hand. As she approached her property, she saw a lone figure on horseback waiting near her fence line. Her breath caught. The man sat motionless, his hands raised and open, palms outward. His rifle was slung across his back, the barrel pointing down. He wore buckskin leggings and a shirt decorated with quillwork, a beaded headband with a single eagle feather, and a bone breastplate that clicked softly in the wind. His face was weathered and strong, his expression calm, but tense like a rope pulled taut. Grace reined Bess to a stop, her hand moving to the revolver at her belt. The man lowered his hand slowly and spoke in clear, accented English. I am Gochvan. The girls are my daughters. Grace kept her hand on the revolver, but did not draw it. She studied the man before her, noting the way he held himself with quiet dignity, despite the tension that must be coiling through him. His eyes were dark and steady, fixed on her face, searching for intent. There was pain there, old and deep, but also a fierce protectiveness that she recognized immediately. How do I know that? She asked. Gashvan reached slowly into a leather pouch at his side. He pulled out a small object and held it up so Grace could see a woven bracelet made of red and yellow thread. Tiny beads worked into the pattern of a running deer. Kolena wore this. She lost it 3 days ago. I found it on the trail where the men chased them. Grace's grip on the revolver loosened. She dismounted, keeping Bess between them as a precaution, and took the bracelet. The weaving was intricate, clearly made by loving hands. The threads were soft with wear, the kind of wear that came from being touched, often treasured. She looked up at Gochvan and saw the raw emotion in his face, barely contained. They are safe. I will take you to them. Relief flickered across his face, so brief she almost missed it. He dismounted as well, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had spent his life on horseback and on foot. As they walked toward the cabin, Grace felt the weight of his presence beside her. He was taller than she had first thought, broad-shouldered, and there was a controlled strength in the way he moved, like a wolf at rest, but ready to spring. When they reached the door, Grace called out before lifting the beam, "Estas Cholena, your father is here." She pushed the door open. Inside, the girls looked up from where they sat at the table, picking at the cornbread Grace had left for them. For a moment, no one moved. Then, Cholena let out a small cry and ran to Gochvan, throwing her arms around his waist. Istas followed more slowly, but her face betrayed her emotion, a crumbling of the careful mask she had worn, tears spilling down her cheeks. Gochvan knelt and embraced them both, murmuring words in Blackfeet that Grace did not understand, but felt the weight of. His voice was low and rough, breaking once as he pulled them close. His hands moved over them, checking their bandages, their faces, their small shoulders, as if he needed to confirm they were real, that they were whole. He looked up at Grace, and his eyes held something she had not expected, gratitude so deep it bordered on anguish. He rose, placed one hand over his heart, then extended it toward her, palm up. "You returned my hearts," he said quietly. "I returned my hands." Grace did not fully understand the gesture, but she recognized its gravity. Gochvan moved to the doorway, lifted the rifle from his back, and laid it across her threshold, the butt pointing toward her, the barrel toward him. It was an act of trust so absolute it took her breath away. He was offering her his weapon, his protection, and his allegiance. "Those men will come back," Gavin said. "They will bring others. I will stand here and make sure they do not reach this door." Grace shook her head. "You cannot do that alone. They will kill you. Then I will die defending what is mine." The simplicity of his statement struck her. He meant it. This man would die to protect his daughters. And now, by extension, he was offering to die to protect her, because she had saved them. It was both humbling and terrifying. "There is another way," Grace said. She moved to the table and spread out a piece of paper, a rough sketch she had made of the local terrain. "The water. They are stealing the water. If we can prove that we can turn the town against them, and if the town turns, the sheriff loses his power." Gochvan studied the map and then reached into his pouch again and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was an old army survey map, creased and worn with pencil marks and notations in the margins. He unfolded it carefully and pointed to a spot marked Cold Spring. "This is the source," he said. "It feeds Storm Creek. The white man Kingsley has built a wall of stone and timber here." He traced a line with his finger. "Line with his. He takes the water for his cattle. The creek runs dry for everyone below. My people, your people. He is choking us all." Grace leaned closer, her shoulder almost brushing his. The map was detailed far more than anything she had seen. "How do you have this?" Gosh's expression darkened. "I was a scout for the army. Before I understood what they wanted from my people, before I stopped," he paused, his jaw tightening. "I drew maps like this. I showed them where the water was, where the trails ran, where our camps were. I thought I was helping. I thought if I cooperated, they would treat us fairly. I was a fool." Grace heard the regret in those words, the self-incrimination, and chose not to press. "You were trying to survive. That is not foolish. It is when your survival helps them destroy your people." Grace looked at the map, at the marks he had made, and felt a plan beginning to form. "If we can get proof that Kingsley's dam is illegal, we can bring it to the judge in Helena. But first, we need to survive the next few days." Gochvan nodded. "I will stay. I will watch." Grace met his eyes. "I have a better idea. Stay inside. help me board up the windows. If they come, we make this cabin a fortress." A faint smile touched Gchevin's mouth. "You think like a warrior. I think like someone who wants to live." They worked through the afternoon reinforcing the door, nailing wooden slats across the windows to create narrow firing slits and stockpiling water and food. The girls helped carrying tools and supplies, their fear gradually replaced by a fragile sense of purpose. Cholena even smiled when Gochvan lifted her onto his shoulders to reach a high nail. Grace watched them, and for the first time in 2 years, the cabin did not feel empty. As they worked, Grace noticed things about Gochvan. The way he moved with economy, never wasting motion. The way he spoke to his daughters, his voice gentle but firm. The way he glanced at Grace when he thought she was not looking, his expression unreadable, but intent. At dusk, a rider appeared on the eastern road. Grace and Goshen watched from the firing slits as the rider stopped at the fence line too far to identify clearly. He raised a hand, waved once, a deliberate mocking gesture, but then turned and rode back toward town. "They are coming," Goshen said. Grace reloaded the revolver and set it on the table beside a box of ammunition. "Then we will be ready." That night they took turns keeping watch. Grace sat by the window during the first shift, listening to the wind and the distant howl of coyotes. Behind her, Gosh lay on the floor near the fireplace, his body positioned between the door and the girls. His breathing was steady, but she knew he was not asleep. She glanced back once and found him watching her, his eyes reflecting the dim glow of the coals. "Why did you help them?" he asked quietly. Grace thought about it. Because they needed help, and because no one else was going to. Many would have turned away, then many are fools. Goshen was silent for a moment. "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Fear. Hatred. The same things I have seen in every white settlement from here to the Missouri River." Grace turned to face him fully. "I have seen enough death. Goshen, my husband died 2 winters ago from pneumonia. I have fought dust storms, drought, and men who thought a woman alone had no right to this land. I am tired of fighting, but I will not let children be hunted like animals. Not on my watch." He nodded slowly and something shifted in his expression, a softening around the edges. "You honor him, your husband?" "I try." Grace paused, then added, "What about you, the girl's mother?" Gosh's face went still. "She died, bringing Chelena into this world. The bleeding would not stop. I held her hand and felt her leave. I promised her I would protect our daughters no matter the cost. That promise is all I have left of her." Grace felt her throat tighten. "I am sorry. So am I." They lapsed into silence. Grace returned her gaze to the window. Hours later, when she woke Gochven for his turn, their hands brushed as she passed him the revolver. His fingers were warm, calloused, steady. She lay down on the blankets the girls had vacated, pulling one over herself, and fell into an uneasy sleep. She woke to the sound of horses. Dawn light filtered through the slats, gray and cold. Grace sat up, her heart pounding. Gochevin was already at the window, his rifle in hand. He glanced back at her and gestured for silence. Grace moved to his side, peering through the narrow gap. A line of riders approached from the south, kicking up dust. 6 men. At the front rode a heavy-set man in a dark coat with a tin star pinned to his chest. Sheriff Blackjack Hollis. Grace recognized him by his thick mustache and the way he sat his horse like a man who had never been questioned. Beside him rode the 2 bounty hunters from the day before, the one with the bruised jaw, now sporting a swollen purple knot. Behind them came 3 deputies armed with rifles and shotguns. "Blast," Grace muttered. She turned to the girls who had woken at the sound of the horses. "Estas take Cholena to the back corner. Stay down." The older girl obeyed immediately, pulling her sister behind the heavy wooden chest that held Grace's winter clothes. Goshan positioned himself at the other window, slit his movements, calm and deliberate. Grace checked her revolver and took a deep breath. The riders stopped 20 yards from the cabin. The sheriff leaned forward in his saddle and raised his voice. Grace called her. "This is Sheriff Hollis. I am here on official business. You are harboring 2 wards of the territory who are to be taken into protective custody. Open your door and send them out, or I will have no choice but to remove you by force." Grace stepped to the door but did not open it. She spoke through the gap in the slats. "Those girls were being hunted, Sheriff. I saved them from men who had no legal right to chase them. I have a writ right here that says otherwise." Hollis pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and waved it. "Signed by the territorial magistrate. These children are orphans, and they are to be placed with a proper household for their own good." "Let me see it," Grace demanded. Hollis hesitated, then rode closer, holding the paper up to the slat. Grace squinted at it. The writing was official-looking, full of legal language and stamps, but something about it felt wrong. The ink was too fresh, the edges too clean, and the signature at the bottom was illegible, just a scroll that could have been anything. Behind her, Gavin spoke quietly. "It is a lie." Grace nodded and called out, "This document is fake, Sheriff, and you know it." Hollis's expression darkened. "You are calling me a liar. I'm calling you a puppet." Grace's voice was cold now. "Kingsley owns you, and everyone in this territory knows it. You are not here to protect those girls. You are here to collect a bounty." Murmurs rose from the riders. One of the deputies shifted uneasily. At that moment, a small crowd began to gather at the edge of Grace's property, drawn by the commotion. Grace recognized faces Harriet Bell, the school teacher, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. John Novak, leaning on his walking stick, and Dr. EMTT, his medical bag in hand. Others followed, farmers and townsfolk, curious and wary. Harriet stepped forward, her voice carrying, "What is the meaning of this, Sheriff? Since when do we hunt children?" Hollis turned his horse toward her. "This is none of your concern, Miss Bell. These are legal matters. Legal matters conducted at gunpoint." Harriet gestured to the armed men. "That does not seem legal to me." Dr. EMTT moved closer, squinting at the right still in Hollis's hand. "Let me see that document, Sheriff." Hollis pulled it back, but EMTT was insistent. "If it is legitimate, you have nothing to hide." Reluctantly, Hollis handed it over. EMTT read it quickly, his frown deepening. "This bears no proper court seal. The signature is illegal, and the date is from 3 days ago, which means it was drawn up after these children went missing. That is not a rescue order, Sheriff. That is a seizure order." A ripple of anger moved through the crowd. John Novak spoke up, his voice hoarse. "We all know what Kingsley is doing with that dam. He is choking us dry so we will sell our land cheap. And now this taking children." Hollis's face flushed red. "You people do not know what you are talking about. I have the law on my side. Then prove it." Grace called from inside the cabin. "Take that writ to Judge Wainwright in Helena. Let him examine it. If it is real, I will hand the girls over myself." Hollis's jaw worked. Behind him, one of the deputies leaned over and whispered something. The sheriff shook his head and turned back to Grace. "I do not have time for that. You have 1 minute to open this door, or I will break it down." Gochevin stepped into view behind the slat, his rifle visible. "You will try." The crowd gasped, seeing a Blackfeet warrior inside a white settler's cabin, armed and defiant, was beyond comprehension for most of them. Hollis stared, his mouth opening and closing. Then his expression hardened. "So that is how it is," he said slowly. "You are siding with them against your own kind." "I am siding with children," Grace shot back, "and I am siding with the truth. Something you seem to have forgotten." Hollis raised his hand, signaling his men. "Forward! Break that door!" The deputies hesitated. The crowd murmured louder now, some voices shouting protests. Harriet stepped directly in front of Hollis's horse, her small frame defiant. "You will not do this, Sheriff. Not while we are here to witness it." Hollis's horse danced sideways. One of the bounty hunters, the one with the bruised jaw, spurred his mount forward, trying to circle around Harriet. Grace saw it happen. She nodded to Gochevin, a silent signal. He understood immediately. Grace opened the door just wide enough to aim and fired a single shot into the ground at the horse's hooves. The animal reared, dumping the rider into the dirt. At the same instant, Goshen fired his rifle skyward, the crack of it echoing across the prairie like thunder. The horses scattered. The deputies fought to control their mounts. The crowd scattered as well, some hitting the ground, others running for cover. Hollis cursed and wheeled his horse around, trying to restore order. But the moment was broken. The intimidation had failed. John Novak shouted above the chaos. "The sheriff is corrupt. Kingsley pays him to look the other way while he steals our water and our children. Are we going to let this stand?" The crowd roared its agreement. Hollis realized he had lost control. He pointed a shaking finger at Grace's cabin. "This is not over. You have made an enemy today, Calder." He yanked his horse around and spurred it back toward town, his men scrambling to follow. The bounty hunter on the ground staggered to his feet, grabbed his horse's reins, and limped after them. The crowd watched them go, then turned their attention to the cabin. Harriet approached cautiously, her eyes wide. "Grace, are you all right?" Grace opened the door, fully stepping out with a revolver lowered. Goshen followed, his rifle still in hand. The crowd gasped again, but Harriet did not flinch. She looked at Gochevin, then at the two small faces peering from behind him. "These are his daughters," Grace said quietly. "They were being hunted. I could not let that happen." Dr. Emmett joined them, his expression grave. "They will come back, Grace, and next time they will not come alone. Kingsley has resources. He will bring more men." He paused, his eyes darting to Gochevis, then away. There was something in his face, a flicker of worry that went beyond the immediate danger. Gochevin spoke, his voice steady. "Tonight they will try to drive us out. They will sabotage the water cut. The fences burn crops. That is how they work. I have seen it before." Grace felt the weight of that truth settle over her. She looked at the crowd, at the faces filled with fear and anger and confusion. "Then we fight back. We prove what Kingsley is doing, and we take it to someone who can stop him." "Who?" John asked. "The sheriff is in Kingsley's pocket. The territorial governor is 200 meters away. Judge Wainwright. EMTT said he is in Deer Lodge, only 3 days' ride. If we can get evidence to him, he has the authority to issue an injunction against the dam." He paused again, and Grace noticed his hands trembling as he gripped his medical bag. "But getting there will not be easy. Kingsley will have men watching the roads." Goshen pulled out the army map and unfolded it on the ground. The crowd leaned in. "This shows Cold Spring and the dam. If we can bring witnesses and documents, it would prove the diversion." "We would need to get there," Grace said, "and we would need to survive long enough to do it." Harriet straightened, her eyes bright. "Then we make sure you do. John, can you organize a watch? We will take turns guarding this cabin. If Kingsley's men come back, they will have to go through all of us." John nodded slowly, leaning on his stick. "I can do that." But Grace noticed something odd. As Harriet spoke, her gaze flicked briefly toward the road, toward the direction Hollis had ridden. It was a quick glance, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Grace pushed the thought aside. Harriet was nervous. They all were. Grace felt a flicker of hope. She looked at Jevon, and he met her gaze with something that might have been respect, or perhaps the beginning of trust. Their fingers brushed briefly as they both reached to pick up the map, and Grace felt the warmth of his skin, the roughness of calluses earned through hard labor and survival. "We haul water now," Jevon said. "Before they cut the pump, we will need barrels and a sledge." Grace nodded. "I have both. Let us move." The next 3 days unfolded in a blur of hard work, sleepless nights, and mounting danger. Grace and Goshen worked side by side, their movements falling into an unspoken rhythm as they prepared for the siege they knew was coming. On the first afternoon, they hauled water from the shallow ford on Storm Creek to Dalmere north of the cabin. Grace hitched Bess to the sledge, a flat wooden platform mounted on iron runners, and loaded it with empty barrels. Gochevin rode his own horse, a lean pinto stallion named Windrunner, and the girls rode double behind Grace. The journey was tense. The creek, once a rushing flow of clear mountain water, was now barely ankle deep, its bed exposed in long stretches of cracked mud. Kingsley's dam had reduced it to a trickle. Dead fish lay in the shallows, their silver bodies rotting in the sun. The smell was overwhelming. As they filled the barrels, Gochvan pointed to the ridgeline to the west. Grace followed his gaze and saw 3 riders silhouetted against the sky, watching. They made no move to approach, but their presence was a clear message. "You are being observed." "Kingsley's men," Grace said quietly. Gochevin nodded. He scanned the terrain, noting the cover provided by scattered boulders and a dry wash that ran parallel to the trail. "If they come, we dropped low and moved to those rocks. I will cover you." Grace's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "Let us hope it does not come to that." They finished loading the barrels and started back. Halfway to the cabin, a rifle shot cracked across the prairie, kicking up dust 10 FT to their left. Bess whinnied and shied. Grace pulled her steady, her hands tight on the reins. Another shot followed closer this time. Cholina cried out, and Istas wrapped her arms around her sister. "Down!" Goshen barked. He vaulted from his horse and grabbed the bridle of Grace's mare, pulling both animals toward the boulders. Grace slid from the saddle, helping the girls down, and they scrambled behind the rocks. The sledge tipped slightly, one barrel rolling free and cracking open water spilling into the thirsty earth. Precious water they could not afford to lose. Gochvan took position at the edge of the boulder, his rifle raised. He scanned the ridge, patient, and unmoving. Grace crouched beside him, the revolver in her hand, her breath coming fast, their shoulders pressed together, and she felt the steady rise and fall of his breathing, the heat of him in the cold air. "3 riders," he said quietly. "One is circling east. The others are holding position. What are they waiting for? Orders or for us to panic?" Grace glanced at the girls. Chilena's eyes were squeezed shut, her hands over her ears. Istas watched Gochevin with fierce concentration, as if memorizing every move he made. Grace felt a surge of protectiveness, so strong it bordered on fury. "We move on, my signal," Jevon said. He waited, counting silently. Then he fired 3 rapid shots at the ridge, not aiming to hit, but to suppress. Now they ran. Grace grabbed Cholenia and lifted her onto the sledge. Istas climbed up beside her sister, and Jevon slapped Bess's rump, sending her into a gallop. Grace ran alongside, one hand on the sledge to steady it, the other clutching the revolver. Jevon brought up the rear, firing twice more to keep the riders at bay. They made it back to the cabin without further shots, but the message was clear. You are not safe anywhere. Grace stumbled as they reached the yard, her boot catching on a hidden root. She pitched forward, and Gochvan caught her arm, steadying her. For a moment, they stood close, breathing hard, his hand warm and firm on her elbow. Their eyes met, and Grace saw something there beyond concern. A connection forged in shared danger. A recognition of something neither of them had expected to find. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded, releasing her arm slowly. "We protect each other now." That night, Dr. Emmett arrived with news from town. He looked haggarded, older than Grace remembered. He had sent a telegram to Judge Wainwright in Deer Lodge requesting an emergency hearing on Kingsley's water rights. But the telegraph operator, a man named Oleg Krupin, had warned EMTT that Kingsley monitored all outgoing messages and often paid the operator to delay or alter them. "We need to send someone in person," EMTT said, seated at Grace's table with a cup of bitter coffee. His hands shook as he lifted the cup. "A rider who can carry the evidence and reach the judge directly." "What evidence?" Grace asked. EMTT reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. "I have been keeping records, water levels, crop failure statements from farmers who have lost everything. It is not much, but it is a start. And if we can add Gochvan's map and perhaps a witness who has seen the dam, it might be enough." Goshan leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. "I will go." "No," Grace said immediately. "You are Blackfeet. Kingsley's men will kill you before you reach Deer Lodge." "Then you go. I cannot leave the girls." Harriet, who had accompanied EMTT, spoke up. "I will take them. I can hide them in the schoolhouse. No one would think to look there." She paused, and Grace noticed again that odd brightness in her eyes, a kind of eagerness that seemed out of place. "I can keep them safe, Grace. I promise." Grace hesitated. She trusted Harriet, but the thought of letting the girls out of her sight made her stomach clench. Yet there was something in Harriet's tone that gave Grace pause. She pushed the thought aside. They had no choice. Gochevin seemed to read her mind. He moved closer, his voice low. "We have no choice. If we do not act now, Kingsley will crush us one by one." Grace met his eyes. In the dim lamplight, she saw the weight he carried, the losses he had endured, and the fierce determination that drove him. She also saw something else, something unspoken, but palpable. He trusted her not just with his daughters' lives, but with the fight ahead. It was a trust she had not asked for, but found herself unwilling to betray. "All right," she said. "But first, we need more evidence. We need to see the dam ourselves." EMTT shook his head. "That is suicide. Kingsley has guards posted around it day and night." "Then we go at night," Goshan said. Emmett's face went pale. "I cannot." He stopped himself, looked away. "I cannot help you with that. It is too dangerous." Grace frowned. EMTT. "I'm sorry, Grace. I have already done what I can. Going to the dam would be." He trailed off his hands, shaking harder now. There was fear in his eyes, yes, but also something else. Something that looked almost like guilt. "It is all right," Grace said, though unease prickled at the back of her neck. "You have done more than enough." But later, after EMTT and Harriet had left, Gosan said quietly, "He is hiding something." "What do you mean, fear?" "Yes, but also shame. I know that look. I have seen it in my own face." Goshan paused. He has done something he regrets, or he has failed to do something. Either way, he carries a burden. Grace wanted to argue to defend EMTT, but she could not shake the feeling that Gochvan was right. The second night, they scouted the dam. Grace and Gachivin left the cabin after midnight, moving on foot through the darkness. The moon was a thin crescent, providing just enough light to navigate by. They followed Storm Creek upstream, staying low and silent. The sound of the water grew louder as they neared the dam. A deep, steady rumble that spoke of pressure and force held barely in check. The dam itself was a crude but effective structure, built of timber beams and packed stone across a narrow gorge. Water pulled behind it in a wide reservoir, glinting like black glass. On the far side, a cell gate channeled the flow into a ditch that ran directly to Kingsley's ranchlands to the south. The creek below the dam was dry, except for a pitiful trickle that barely wet the rocks. "There," Goshen whispered, pointing to a guard station built on a platform above the dam. A single lantern burned there, and Grace could just make out the shadow of a man leaning against the railing, a rifle propped beside him. Another guard patrolled the base of the structure, his boots crunching on gravel. They withdrew carefully, retracing their steps. As they moved through a stand of cottonwood trees, Gochvan stumbled on a root hidden in the darkness. Grace caught his arm, steadying him. For a moment, they stood close, her hand on his forearm, his breath warm against her cheek. Neither of them moved. The night air was cold, but where their bodies nearly touched, Grace felt heat. "Are you hurt?" she whispered. "No." His voice was low, rough. "Thank you." She released his arm reluctantly, but her fingers lingered a moment longer than necessary. They continued on, but Grace felt the lingering warmth of that contact long after they returned to the cabin. Back at the cabin, they reported what they had seen to John and a few other farmers who had gathered for a strategy meeting. John frowned, scribbling notes. "We need proof that Kingsley built it without proper permits, that is, illegal diversion punishable by injunction and fines. But we would need documents from the Territorial Land Office. Or, we need to get into Kingsley's office," Harriet said thoughtfully. She had arrived late, breathless, claiming she had been delayed at the school. "He keeps records. Everyone knows that. He is meticulous about it." Grace and Gichevin exchanged a glance. The same thought had occurred to both of them. But Grace noticed again that Harriet seemed unusually eager to push them toward action, almost as if she were trying to rush them into something. On the third day, they rode to Lantern's End under the pretense of buying supplies. In truth, Grace wanted to assess the town's mood and, if possible, get access to any documents Kingsley might have on file. Harriet had agreed to take the girls to the schoolhouse for the day, keeping them out of sight. As Grace watched Harriet Letzt and Cholena away, she felt a twist of unease. But what choice did they have? Grace and Goshen moved through the streets, carefully aware of the stares that followed them. A white widow and a Blackfeet warrior walking together was unusual enough to draw attention. And Grace knew that every eye that saw them would report back to Kingsley. She heard whispers, saw women pull their children closer, saw men spit into the dirt as they passed. Grace called her. "What are you thinking bringing one of them into town?" A rancher named Sam Polk called out. Grace stopped, turned to face him. "I am thinking that my business is my own, Sam, and I suggest you think the same about yours." Polk's face wrined, but he said nothing more. They stopped at Dr. Emt's office first. He was treating a farmer with a broken finger and nodded for them to wait in the back room. When he joined them, he looked worried, no more than worried. He looked terrified. "Kingsley's men are everywhere," EMTT said quietly. "I heard they cut John Novak's pump last night. He woke up to find his water barrel smashed and his well fouled. He cannot stay on his land now. He's packing up to leave." Grace felt a chill. They are driving people out. Yes, and it is working. Fear is a powerful weapon. EMTT paused, his eyes darting to the door. "Grace, I need to tell you something. I need to." He stopped, swallowed hard. I need to tell you to be careful. That is all. Just be careful." Grace frowned. "EMTT, what is wrong?" "Nothing. Nothing is wrong. I just—" He pulled a key from his pocket, his hands shaking so badly the key rattled. "This is to the back door of the land office. The clerk, Thomas Briggs, is a friend of mine. He has gone to Denver for the week, and he asked me to check on his office while he was away. If there are records of Kingsley's dam permits, they would be filed there." Grace took the key, her hand closing around the cold metal. She studied EMTT's face, searching for answers, but he would not meet her eyes. "Thank you, EMTT." He nodded quickly and left the room, closing the door behind him with more force than necessary. Goche spoke quietly. "He is afraid, more afraid than he should be." "I know." Grace tucked the key into her pocket. "But we need those documents." They waited until dusk, then slipped through the alley behind the land office. The building was dark and silent. Grace unlocked the door, and they stepped inside, closing it softly behind them. Goshen lit a match, and they moved quickly through the narrow room, scanning the filing cabinets. Grace found the drawer labeled Water Rights, 18751, 1878, and pulled it open. Inside were dozens of documents, each one detailing permits for wells, dams, irrigation ditches, and other water projects. She flipped through them, her fingers trembling. Then she found a permit application for Storm Creek, filed by Nathan Kingsley, dated 6 months earlier. But stamped across it in red ink was a single word: denied. "He built it anyway," Grace breathed, without approval. Goshen leaned over her shoulder, studying the document. "This is the proof we need." A floorboard creaked above them. Grace froze. Gosh extinguished the match immediately, plunging them into darkness. They stood motionless, listening. Footsteps crossed the ceiling, slow and deliberate. Someone was in the building. Grace's heart hammered in her chest. She grabbed the permit and folded it quickly, tucking it into her coat. Gochvan took her arm and guided her toward the back door. They moved silently, their breaths shallow. Just as they reached the door, a voice called out from the stairway. Who was down there? It was not the clerk. Grace recognized the voice. Flint-Face Mercer Kingsley's foreman. She and Gashvan bolted through the door and into the alley, running hard. Behind them, Mercer shouted, and boots pounded on the stairs. They reached the horses and mounted quickly, spurring them into a gallop. Shots rang out, splintering the wooden fence beside them. But they did not look back. They rode hard for an hour, not stopping until they were certain they were not being followed. When they finally slowed, Grace was breathing hard, her hands shaking from adrenaline. Gochvan pulled up beside her, his face set. "We have what we came for," he said. Grace nodded, pulling the folded permit from her coat. It was proof of Kingsley's crime, clear and undeniable. But it also meant they had declared war. That night, back at the cabin, they prepared for the next phase. Harriet had returned with the girls, and they were safe, but subdued. Cholena had clung to Grace when she walked through the door, and Istas had watched Gosan with eyes that held both relief and fear. As the night deepened, Grace sat at the table with Goshen, the permit spread between them. John had left to rally support among the other farmers, and Harriet had gone to draft a letter to Judge Wainwright outlining their case. The cabin was quiet, except for the crackle of the fire. "Why did you do it?" Goshen asked suddenly. Grace looked up. "Do what?" "Help us. Risk everything for my children. You did not know them. You did not know me." Grace considered the question. "I told you before because they needed help." "There is more," Goshen said quietly. "You carry pain. I see it in your eyes. You have lost someone." Grace's throat tightened. She had not spoken about her husband in months, and the grief was still a raw wound. My husband died 2 years ago. Pneumonia. We had only been married 3 years. I thought we would have a lifetime. She paused, her voice breaking. He was a good man, gentle. He loved this land, believed we could make something of it. And then winter came and he got sick, and there was nothing I could do. I watched him slip away day by day until there was nothing left. Goshen was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "My wife died in childbirth. Trena's mother. She was strong like you. She fought to live, but the bleeding would not stop. I held her hand as she left this world. I promised her I would protect our daughters no matter the cost. That is why I do this. That is why I will not stop until they are safe." Grace felt tears sting her eyes. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his ear. Goshen turned his hand, his fingers curling around hers. The touch was warm, solid, grounding. His thumb traced a small circle on her palm, a gesture both tender and deliberate. For the first time in 2 years, Grace did not feel alone. "I have watched you these past days," Goshen said softly. "The way you move, the way you fight, the way you care for my daughters. You are a warrior, Grace. You just do not call yourself one." Grace smiled despite herself. "I am a widow trying to survive." "No, you are more than that. You are someone who stands when others run. That is the definition of a warrior." Grace felt her chest tighten. She looked at their joined hands, at the contrast of her pale skin against his darker, weathered fingers. "What happens after this when Kingsley is stopped? I do not know." Gochevin admitted, "My people are scattered. The army pushed us off our lands years ago. I have been trying to keep my daughters safe, moving from place to place. But I am tired of running. I want them to have a home, a real home. They could stay here," Grace herself say. The words came out before she could stop them. "With us, if you wanted." Gosh's eyes widened slightly. Then his expression softened. "You would do that? Take in a Blackfeet family?" "I would take in you," Grace said simply. "The people I care about." Govern leaned across the table, his free hand reaching up to cup her face. His palm was warm against her cheek. "Grace." The door burst open. Harriet stood there, her face pale, her eyes wild. "They are coming, Kingsley's men. They are riding this way right now." Grace and Gosan sprang apart, grabbing their weapons. But Grace's mind was racing. How had Harriet known? How had she gotten the warning in time? There was no time to ask. Outside, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder. Many horses. Too many. The next morning, John Novak arrived at the cabin with urgent news. He was out of breath, his face pale, and his hands shook as he leaned on his walking stick. They found something. He panted at the old Greystone mine. Harry Hookend and his boys were holed up there. Sheriff Hollis raided it this morning, but not because he wanted to. Harriet and some of the other women cornered him in the street and shamed him into it. They found a cash box. Grace's pulse quickened. What was in it? John pulled a folded paper from his coat. "This one of the deputies brought it to EMTT, and EMTT sent me to find you." Grace unfolded the paper. It was a ledger written in neat, precise handwriting. Each entry listed a name, a date, and an amount of money. Grace scanned the list, her stomach turning. CNI August 12th, $300. Sheriff Hollis weekly retainer. 50. Hook delivery fee, 150. Chilena and Istas. Gochean said quietly, reading over her shoulder. His voice was hard as iron. "They were going to sell my daughters." Grace flipped through the pages. There were more names, more children, more payments. This was not just about water. This was about profit, about a systematic operation to seize native children and sell them into servitude or forced assimilation. The dam was part of it, a way to drive people off the land so there would be no one left to protect them. But there was something else in the cash box as well. John handed her a second document, an old army survey map. Grace recognized it immediately. It was a copy of Gosan's map, but with additional notations. Her breath caught when she saw the handwriting in the margins. It was Gochvin's. She looked up at him. "This is yours." Gosh's jaw tightened. He took the map, his fingers tracing the familiar lines. "I drew these maps when I worked for the army. I thought I was helping my people by showing the soldiers where the water was, where the safe trails were. But they used the information to push us off the land, to cut us off from our resources. When I understood what I had done, I quit. I took my maps and left, but someone kept copies." "Kingsley," Grace said. "He must have gotten them from the army. He used your maps to build his dam in the exact spot that would hurt both the settlers and the Blackfeet at the most." Goshen closed his eyes. "This is my fault." "No," Grace said firmly. She grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. "You did not know. You were trying to help. Kingsley is the one who twisted it. He is the one who will pay." Goshen stared at her, his expression raw. Then he nodded a single sharp motion. "We end this now." Jan leaned forward. "There is more. EMTT thinks we can use this ledger to force a town meeting. If we can show the people what Kingsley has been doing, they will turn on him. But we have to move fast. Kingsley knows the cash box is missing. He is probably already planning his next move." Grace looked at Gochvan. His eyes met hers. And in that moment, something shifted between them. It was not just trust anymore. It was partnership forged in fire and blood and shared purpose. She felt the weight of it settle over her like a mantle. "We call the meeting," she said, "and we bring the fight to him." That afternoon, they rode into Lantern's End, and the ledger and maps wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into Grace's saddlebag. Harriet had already gathered a crowd in front of the town hall, and Dr. EMTT stood on the steps, calling for order. The townsfolk were restless, angry, and afraid. Too many of them had lost water, lost crops, lost hope. Grace and Gachevin dismounted and pushed through the crowd. Harriet saw them and gestured them forward. Grace climbed the steps, the weight of every eye on her. She pulled the ledger from her bag and held it up. "This," she said, her voice carrying across the square, "is proof of what Kingsley has been doing. He has been stealing water to drive us off our land. He has been seizing native children and selling them for profit. And he has been paying the sheriff to look the other way." A roar went up from the crowd. Sheriff Hollis, standing near the back, pushed forward, his face red. "That is a lie." Grace opened the ledger and read aloud. "Sheriff Hollis, weekly retainer, $50 August 5th, August 12th, August 19th. Shall I continue, Sheriff?" Hollis's mouth opened and closed. The crowd turned on him, voices rising in anger. Dr. EMTT stepped forward and took the ledger, holding it up for all to see. "This is evidence of corruption and conspiracy. We have been betrayed by the very men sworn to protect us." At that moment, a commotion erupted at the edge of the square. Riders poured in, led by Flint-Face Mercer. They were armed, their rifles held ready. The crowd scattered, people shouting and diving for cover. Mercer reined his horse to a stop in front of the steps and leveled his rifle at Grace. "That belongs to Mr. Kingsley," he said coldly. "Hand it over." Grace did not move. Gosh stepped in front of her, his rifle raised. "No." Mercer's eyes narrowed. "You are making a mistake, Savage." "The only mistake," Gochvan said, his voice deadly calm, "is yours." The tension stretched taut as a bowering. Grace felt her heart pounding in her chest. Then from the crowd, a voice called out, "We stand with them!" It was Jan Novak, leaning on his stick, but standing tall. One by one, others joined him. Dr. EMTT, though Grace noticed his face was pale and his hands were shaking. Oleg Krupin, the telegraph operator, and a dozen other farmers and townspeople. They formed a line between Mercer's men and the steps. Mercer hesitated. He looked at the crowd, at the determination in their faces, and something in his expression faltered. He lowered his rifle and spat into the dirt. This is not over. He wheeled his horse and rode off, his men following. The crowd erupted in cheers. Grace felt her knees go weak, but Gosan's hand on her shoulder steadied her. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch not just respect, but something deeper, something that went beyond words. But there was no time to dwell on it. Dr. EMTT was already organizing a meeting for that evening, and Grace knew the real fight was just beginning. The town meeting convened at dusk in the small church at the edge of Lantern's End. Benches filled quickly, and those who could not find seats stood along the walls. The air was thick with tension and the smell of sweat and wood smoke. Grace stood at the front beside Goshaven, and the ledger and map spread on a table before them. Harriet had taken the girls to her home, keeping them safe and away from the coming confrontation. Dr. EMTT called the meeting to order. He explained the evidence, reading key entries from the ledger and showing the maps that proved Kingsley's dam was built illegally. The crowd listened in stunned silence. When EMTT finished, he opened the floor for questions. A rancher named Sam Polk stood. "What do you expect us to do about it?" "Kingsley is the biggest landowner in the territory. He has money lawyers and men with guns. We are just farmers." "We are citizens," John Novak said, rising with effort. "We have rights, and we have the law on our side now. Judge Wainwright needs to see this evidence. If he does, he can issue an injunction and shut down the dam." "And how do we get it to him?" Someone else called. "Kingsley controls the telegraph. He has men watching the roads. Any rider we send will be stopped." Grace spoke up. "Then we send someone he would not expect." All eyes turned to her. She met their gazes steadily. "I will go tomorrow at first light. I will ride to Deer Lodge and put this ledger in the judge's hands myself." "You will not make it," Polk said flatly. "Kingsley will have you killed before you reach the county line." "Then I will die trying," Grace said. The words came out harder than she intended, but she meant them. She had come too far, risked too much to turn back now. Gochevin stepped forward. "She will not go alone. I will ride with her." A murmur ran through the crowd. Polk shook his head. "That is even worse. A white woman and a Blackfeet man traveling together. You will be lynched before you get 10 miles. Then what do you suggest?" Goshan's voice was quiet, but carried an edge that silenced the room. "That we do nothing. That we let Kingsley steal from us, kill our children, and destroy our homes. If you are too afraid to fight, then step aside, but do not tell us we cannot." The silence stretched. Then Harriet stood, but before she could speak, her face crumpled and tears began to stream down her cheeks. "I cannot let you do this," she said, her voice breaking, "not without telling you the truth." The room went still. Grace felt ice forming in her stomach. Harriet, the school teacher, took a shaking breath. "Kingsley approached me 2 months ago. He knew I had debts from my father's illness. He offered to pay them off if I would keep him informed about what was happening in town, who was talking against him, who might cause trouble." She looked at Grace, her eyes pleading. I said, "Yes, I was desperate. My father was dying, and I had no money for medicine for the doctor. I thought it was just information. I never thought it would come to this. Children hunted, people driven from their homes. I thought it was just business." The crowd erupted in angry shouts. Several people surged toward Harriet, but EMTT and Jan blocked them. "Wait," EMT shouted. "She is telling us now. That counts for something." Does it? Grace's voice was cold. She felt betrayed, furious. All those times Harriet had offered to help to take the girls had she been planning to hand them over to Kingsley. How many others have suffered because of what you told Kingsley? I do not know, Harriet said, sobbing openly now. But I warned you last night. When I told you they were coming, that was real. I rode out to their camp and overheard them planning the raid. I came straight to you. I am done helping him. I will not do it anymore. I will testify against him. I will tell Judge Wainwright everything. Please let me make this right. Grace looked at Gochvan. His expression was unreadable, but after a long moment, he nodded slightly. Grace turned back to Harriet. Then you will come with us, and if you betray us again, there will be no mercy. Harriet nodded quickly. I understand. I swear to you, Grace, I am done with him. The meeting continued, but the mood had shifted. Trust was fragile, and Harriet's confession had shaken everyone. But it also gave them crucial information. They knew Kingsley's plan now, and they could adapt. EMTT stood, but his hands were shaking worse than ever. If Kingsley is planning an ambush on the main road, we send a decoy, a wagon, heading south, making noise and drawing attention. Meanwhile, Grace, Gochan, and Harriet take the old mining trail north, circle around, and approach Deer Lodge from the west. That trail is rough, John said. It will add half a day to the journey, but it will keep them alive, EMTT replied. He paused, took a breath. There is something I need to say. He looked at Grace, his eyes filled with shame. 2 weeks ago, Kingsley came to me. He threatened to burn my practice if I did not keep quiet about the water problems. He said he would tell everyone I had been stealing laudanum for my own use, a lie, but one that would ruin me. I agreed. I stayed silent when I should have spoken. I am a coward. His voice broke. But I am trying to make it right now. Please let me help. Grace felt the anger drain out of her. Emmett was human flawed, frightened. But he was trying. You are helping Emmett. You have been helping all along, even when you were afraid. That takes courage. EMTT nodded, wiping his eyes. The plan was agreed upon. They would leave before dawn while the decoy wagon departed at first light to draw Kingsley's men away. Grace and Jevon returned to the cabin to prepare. The girls were already asleep in Harriet's care, and the cabin felt empty without them. Grace moved through the familiar space, packing food, water, and ammunition. Gauchvan checked his rifle and sharpened his knife, his movements methodical. They worked in silence for a while. Then Grace spoke. Do you trust her, Harriet? Gauchvan paused. I trust fear. She's afraid of what she has done. That fear will keep her honest. And if it does not, I will know. Grace nodded slowly. She moved to the window and looked out at the dark prairie. I am afraid too. Gauchvan crossed to her side. So am I. She turned to face him. Of what? Of losing you. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything unspoken between them. You have become important to me, Grace. More important than I ever expected. You and my daughters are all I have left in this world, and I find myself wanting more time with you, more days, more everything. Grace felt her chest tighten. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. You will not lose me, I promise. He covered her hand with his, holding it against his cheek. Then, slowly, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, tentative at first, but it carried the force of all their shared fears and hopes. Grace leaned into him, her free hand gripping his shirt, and for a moment the world outside the cabin ceased to exist. There was only this, the warmth of his mouth on hers, the strength of his arms as they wrapped around her, the beating of his heart against her chest. When they finally pulled apart, Grace rested her forehead against his. "We survive this," she whispered. "Together, and then we figure out what comes next." "Together," Goshen echoed. "Always." They stood like that for a long time, drawing strength from each other before finally turning to finish their preparations. The final confrontation began, not with a battle, but with a ride through darkness. They left before dawn, Harriet riding with them, her face pale but determined. The old mining trail was as rough as Jan had warned, winding through rocky terrain and dense pine forests. But they made good time, and by midday they were approaching Deer Lodge from an unexpected direction. They reached the town in the late afternoon, exhausted but alive. Judge Wainwright's office was in the courthouse, a solid stone building in the center of town. They went directly there only to find the judge presiding over a hearing. A clerk informed them he would be available within the hour. They waited in the hallway, tense and watchful. Harriet sat apart from them, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes red from crying. Grace felt a complex mix of anger and pity toward her. Betrayal was a hard thing to forgive, but Harriet's warning had likely saved their lives. Finally, the judge emerged. Wainwright was an older man, gay-haired and stern, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades dispensing justice. He invited them into his chambers, and they laid out their case, the ledger, the maps, the permit denial, Gosan's stolen surveys, and Harriet's testimony about Kingsley's network of corruption. Wainwright listened intently, asking pointed questions. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied them. "This is grave indeed. If what you say is true, Mr. Kingsley has violated multiple territorial laws. However, I cannot act solely on documents and testimony. I need to see the dam myself and question additional witnesses." "Then come to Lantern's End," Grace said. "We will show you everything." Wainwright nodded. "I will leave within the hour with a contingent of territorial marshals. But be warned, if this is fabricated, you will face serious consequences." "It is not," Grace said firmly, "and we will prove it." They left the courthouse and mounted their horses, preparing to return. But as they rode through the town square, Oleg Kurpin, the telegraph operator from Lantern's End, came running toward them, waving frantically. "Wait! Wait!" he shouted, gasping for breath. He reached them and bent double, wheezing. "The damn Kingsley is reinforcing it right now. He is adding more timber and rock. If he finishes, it will be near impossible to remove." And he looked up, his face stricken. "He has taken hostages. Dr. Jan Novak and your girls. He has them at the dam site. He says if anyone tries to stop him, he will kill them." Gutchevin did not wait. He spurred his horse and rode his face a mask of fury. Grace and Harriet followed, and behind them, Judge Wainwright and a contingent of marshals mounted up as well. The ride back felt endless. Grace's mind raced with terrible images. Cholina and Istas frightened, EMTT wounded. Jan hurt. She pushed Bess harder, leaning low over the mayor's neck, ignoring the burn in her legs and the ache in her back. They reached the dam site as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the gorge. A crowd had gathered on the near bank, townsfolk, farmers, and Blackfeet families, all kept at bay by a line of armed guards. The dam loomed ahead, larger and more forbidding than Grace remembered. Fresh timber beams had been added, and men swarmed over the structure like ants, hammering and hauling stone. On the platform above the dam stood Nathan Kingsley himself. He was a tall man in an expensive coat. His silver hair slicked back, his expression one of smug satisfaction. Beside him, Dr. EMTT and John Novak knelt with their hands tied behind their backs. EMTT had blood trickling from a cut on his temple. Jay's face was swollen, one eye blackened, and behind them, held by two of Kingsley's men, were Cholina and Istas. The girls were terrified, Helena crying silently, Istas's face set in grim determination. Grace dismounted and pushed through the crowd. Goshen was already at the front. His rifle raised, his entire body vibrating with rage. Kingsley saw them and smiled. Ah, the noble savage and his white protector. How touching. Come to rescue the hostages. I'm afraid they are staying right here until I finish my work. Let them go, Kingsley. Grace called, her voice shaking with fury. Judge Wainwright is here. Your game is over. Kingsley glanced at the judge, who had ridden up beside the crowd, flanked by marshals. His smile did not falter. The judge, how delightful. But I think you misunderstand the situation. This dam is built on my land with my resources. I have every right to be here. These trespassers tried to sabotage my property, so I detained them. I am well within my rights. That is a lie, Goshen said, his voice shaking with barely contained violence. The spring is on shared land. You stole it. Shared land. Kingsley laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. There is no such thing. Land belongs to whoever can take it and hold it. And I can. He gestured to his men. I have 20 armed guards here. You have what? A handful of marshals and a mob of dirt farmers. You are outgunned, Your Honor. So, I suggest you turn around and go back to Deer Lodge. Judge Wainwright pushed his horse forward, his face grim. Mr. Kingsley, I am ordering you to release those hostages immediately and cease all construction on this dam pending a full investigation. Kingsley waved dismissively. You have no authority here, Your Honor. This is private property, and I will not be bullied. Then I will make it public, Wainwright said coldly. He turned to the crowd. By the power vested in me by the territorial government, I am declaring this structure an illegal diversion. It was built without proper permits in violation of water rights law. I am ordering its immediate dismantling. Anyone who resists will be charged with obstruction of justice. Kingsley's smile faded. His eyes hardened, and he gestured sharply to his men. Rifles were raised, pointing at the crowd. You will do no such thing. I have 20 armed men here, and you have what? 6 marshals. I do not think so. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some people began to back away. Grace felt panic rising in her chest. They had come so far, and now it was unraveling. But then something unexpected happened. Jan Novak, despite his bound hands and battered face, lurched to his feet and shouted, "Shoot me then! Go ahead! But you will have to kill all of us, and then the whole territory will know what you are." One of Kingsley's guards moved toward John, raising his rifle butt to strike him. John did not flinch. The guard hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, Chev enacted. He had been silently circling to the side, using the crowd as cover. Now he vaulted onto the lower beams of the dam, moving with the agility of a cat. Grace saw what he was doing, and her heart leapt into her throat. He had a stick of black powder from the mine wrapped in oilcloth tucked into his belt. "Gosh, Evan," she screamed. But he was already climbing, moving toward the CL gate mechanism. Kingsley saw him and shouted, "Stop him! Shoot him!" Guards turned their rifles on Gachevin, but the angle was bad. If they fired, they risked hitting their own men on the platform. Gochvan reached the CL gate and pulled out the explosive. He lit the fuse with a match. "Everyone down!" he roared. He hurled the black powder at the base of the gate mechanism and dove off the platform into the water below. The explosion was deafening, a massive boom that shook the entire structure. The CL gate shattered, sending a geyser of water and splintered wood into the air. The guards scattered, shouting in confusion. The platform shook violently, and Kingsley lost his footing, stumbling backward. EMTT and John, still bound, threw themselves flat. But Cholena and Istas were caught in the chaos. One of the guards holding them lost his grip and the girls broke free. They ran, but the platform was shaking apart beneath them. Coena stumbled at the edge, teetering over the churning water below. Grace did not think. She sprinted toward the dam, her boots pounding on the wet stone. She reached the platform just as Cholina's foot slipped. Grace grabbed the girl's arm and pulled her back, but the force of it sent Grace sliding toward the edge. Her boots lost purchase on the slick wood. She was falling. A hand clamped around her wrist. Goshen. He had climbed back up, soaking wet, his face strained with effort. He hauled Grace and Chelena back onto solid ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Are you hurt?" he demanded. "No," Grace panted. "Go get the others." Ististas had freed Emmett and John, cutting their bonds with a piece of broken wood. Goshen grabbed Kingsley, who was trying to flee across the damaged platform. The rancher swung wildly his fist, connecting with Gochevin's jaw. Gochevin staggered but did not let go. They struggled locked together at the edge of the platform. "You will not win," Kingsley screamed. "I own this territory. I own everything. You own nothing." Goshen snarled. He twisted using Kingsley's momentum against him and threw the rancher to the platform floor. Judge Wainwright's marshals reached them and pulled Kingsley away, cuffing his hands behind his back. But Kingsley was not finished. "Merc!" he shouted. "Shoot them! Shoot them all!" Flint face. Mercer raised his rifle, aiming at Goshen. Grace saw it happening as if in slow motion. She raised her revolver and fired. The shot hit Mercer in the shoulder, spinning him around. He dropped his rifle and fell. The remaining guards threw down their weapons and surrendered. The crowd surged forward, cheering. The dam was damaged but not destroyed. Water pouring through the breach in a controlled flow that would restore the creek below. Grace sat on the platform, Chelena in her arms, watching as Goshen was helped to his feet by Dr. EMTT. The doctor's face was pale, but his eyes were sharp. "That was the craziest thing I've ever seen," he said, grinning despite the blood on his face. "Gosh." Evan touched his split lip and winced. It worked. John Novak limped over, leaning heavily on his stick. "You saved my life, Savage," he said, his voice rough. Then he extended his hand. "Thank you." Gochevin stared at the offered hand for a moment, then took it. "You are welcome." Grace stood still holding Chelena and walked to Gochevin. She did not say anything. She just reached out with her free hand and took his squeezing tightly. He squeezed back, and in that moment words were unnecessary. Judge Wainwright approached, flanked by his marshals. Mr. Kingsley, you are under arrest for illegal water diversion, conspiracy, kidnapping, and unlawful imprisonment, kidnapping, and attempted murder. Sheriff Hollis will also be taken into custody. And Mr. Mercer, you will face charges of assault and conspiracy once that shoulder is patched up." He turned to Grace and Gochevin. "You two just saved a lot of lives today. The territory owes you a debt." Grace shook her head. "We just did what was right." Within a week, Judge Wainwright had conducted a full hearing in Lantern's End. Kingsley was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison. Sheriff Hollis received 10 years for corruption. Flint Face Mercer and his men faced lesser charges, but were also imprisoned. Harriet Bell testified against all of them, her voice steady despite her tears. In recognition of her cooperation, she was not charged, but the weight of her betrayal drove her to leave Lantern's End. She moved south to Denver to start over. The dam was modified under Wainwright's supervision, its SLLE gates adjusted to allow fair water distribution to all downstream users. Kingsley's estate was liquidated, and the proceeds funded public pumps and siestans for both the settlers and the Blackfoot families. Wainwright issued an injunction, and recognized Cold Spring for common use under territorial law, accessible to all, regardless of race or property ownership. It was a small victory in a vast and unjust landscape, but it mattered. Dr. EMTT recovered fully, though he bore a scar on his temple that he claimed made him look distinguished. He never took another bribe, and his practice thrived. John Novak was appointed caretaker of the water distribution system, a position that gave him both purpose and security. Grace stood at the edge of her property on a bright spring morning, watching the water flow through the repaired irrigation ditch. The wheat she had planted was already sprouting tender green shoots pushing through the dark earth. The sight filled her with quiet joy. The land was healing, and so was she. Behind her, she heard the sound of hammering. She turned to see Gochvan and John working together to finish the liento near the fence line. It was a simple structure, just a roof and 3 walls, but it was sturdy and dry. The girls would have a place to stay when they visited, splitting their time between Grace's homestead and the Blackfeet camp to the north. Though increasingly they stayed at Grace's cabin more than they left. Cholina and Istas ran past her, chasing each other through the grass, their laughter bright and unburdened. Istas had grown taller in the past weeks, her confidence returning with each safe day. Cholina still clung to Grace sometimes, but her smiles came more easily now. They were healing too. Gochevin set down his hammer and walked over to Grace. His face was tanned from long days in the sun, his expression peaceful in a way she had not seen before. "It is finished," he said, the lean to everything. He gestured to the fields, the water, the girls. "We are safe. We are together. It is finished." Grace smiled. "Not quite." He raised an eyebrow. "What is left?" She took a breath, feeling suddenly shy. "You have not asked me properly." Govan's eyes widened slightly, then softened. He took her hands in his grip warm and steady. Grace called her. "You saved my daughters. You saved my life. You fought beside me when no one else would. I have nothing to offer you but hard work, uncertain days, and a family that straddles 2 worlds. But if you will have me, I will stand beside you for the rest of my days. I will protect you, honor you, and love you with everything I have. Will you marry me?" Grace felt tears sting her eyes, but they were tears of joy. "Yes, 1,000 times. Yes." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, and she buried her face in his shoulder. Around them, the prairie stretched vast and endless. But for the first time in years, Grace did not feel dwarfed by it. She felt rooted, anchored home. That evening they gathered with the community for a celebration. EMTT brought his fiddle. John brought cider, and families from both the town and the Blackfeet camp came together to share food and stories. It was not perfect. Old prejudices and fears did not vanish overnight, but it was a beginning, a fragile, hopeful beginning. As the sun set, casting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Grace stood with Goshen at the edge of the gathering. Chelena and Istas played nearby, their voices mingling with those of other children, both white and Blackfeet, playing together without the weight of their parents' histories. The creek sang its steady song full and strong once more. "We did it," Grace said quietly. "We did," Gochvan agreed. "And tomorrow we begin again." Grace leaned into him, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. They stood together as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. The future was uncertain, as it always had been on this harsh and beautiful land. But they would face it together, a family forged not by blood alone, but by courage, sacrifice, and love earned through fire. And in that moment, under the vast Montana sky, Grace Calder felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Hope. not just for herself, but for the life they would build together, for the children they would raise, and for the land they would share. The water thieves had been stopped, the dam was opened, and the prairie had